Sea ice off the west coast of Victoria Island, Northwest Territories, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, spring 1958. The middle of a working day. Special Constable Peter Esau of Sachs Harbor and Constable Bob Knights, on patrol toward Holman Island, the community known today as Ulukaktok. The photograph that survives of that patrol sits in the Northwest Territories archives with a file number and a one-line caption. In it, Esau is not riding the back of the sled. He is in front of the dogs. That position is not a detail of composition. It is the operational structure of the patrol, photographed. The man in front chooses the line. He is the one deciding which ice will carry a loaded komatik and which ice will not, where the pressure ridges can be crossed without unloading, how far the party can run before the light goes, and where it will stop when it does. Everything behind him, the dogs, the sled, the constable, the rations, the authority of the federal government of Canada in a district larger than most European countries, moves along a route selected by one man walking ahead of it. The force recorded that patrol as a patrol. 2 men, 1 team, 1 destination, a return date. It did not have a column on the form for the thing that made the patrol possible. Peter Esau held the rank of Special Constable. So did the men who took RCMP members down the Mackenzie in canoes and up the Peel in winter and out onto the Beaufort ice for 60 years before him. The rank existed because of a specific institutional problem the force had never solved. What was that problem, and why could the RCMP not solve it with its own training? The problem was that the institution could deliver a man to the north and could not make him competent there. An RCMP detachment in the Arctic in the first half of the 20th century was, in equipment terms, almost nothing. A frame building or two on a gravel shore, a storehouse, a stove and a supply of coal oil, a flagstaff, a dog team, a komatik, harness, a primus, a tent, a rifle, a notebook. There was no road because there was no road system. There was no vehicle because no vehicle would function. For most of this period there was no radio, and when radio arrived, it arrived late and unevenly, and it did not travel with the patrol. The dog team was not a picturesque survival. It was the detachment's entire transport capability. A sled dog in Arctic conditions was expected to pull somewhere in the range of 45 to 80 kilograms, and a team could make anywhere from 25 to 120 kilometers in a day, depending on the load, the number of dogs, the surface, and the weather. Those numbers are the operating envelope of Canadian federal authority across a third of the country. But a dog team is not a machine you are issued. It is a system that has to be fed, driven, navigated, sheltered, and repaired by someone who knows how. And none of that knowledge existed at the training depot in Regina. So the force bought it locally. It had been doing so from the beginning, and it had a name for the men it bought it from. Where did that name come from, and when did the RCMP first put it on a payroll? Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you have been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of Canadian patrol between 1900 and 1980. The vehicle, the posting, the territory knowledge, that years in one place built in the officer who covered the same ground in 4 seasons, and the communities those officers served, in the full complexity of what that service meant in this era. Not Mountie mythology. The documented operational and human reality of patrol in a country whose geography required its officers to know their territory the way no centralized system has ever been asked to know it. What did a lifetime on one coast give a special constable that no GPS unit and no centralized dispatch has ever been designed to hold? And if you served in this era, or your family did, put it in the comments. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle served as a special constable, at Aklavik, at Sachs Harbor, at Pond Inlet, at Fort Resolution, anywhere at all, what did he know about the country he took those members through? Next on this channel, the patrol that ran from Old Crow to Fort McPherson in March 1969, the last time the RCMP moved a dog team on duty, and what went off the establishment along with the dogs, back on the road. The name came out of the very first movement the force ever made. When the Northwest Mounted Police rode west in 1874, the March West, the founding operation of the institution that would become the RCMP, it employed Métis men as guides and interpreters, not as ornament. The column was moving across country its officers had never seen, toward peoples whose languages its officers did not speak. In 1875, the force formalized this with an employee category called Scouts. In 1892, it discontinued that category, retaining a few men specifically as interpreters, and began engaging First Nations and Métis men instead under a different designation, Special Constable. Read the sequence carefully, because it tells you what the force had learned about itself in 18 years. It had tried calling these men Scouts, which describes a function performed for an organization. It settled on Special Constable, which is a rank inside one. The duties recorded against that rank across the following decades are not military sounding: guide, interpreter, forerunner, dog driver, hunter, fisherman, woodcutter, cook. Men were engaged for these roles sometimes on the spot, at the point where a patrol met the limit of what it could do by itself. Every item on that list is a survival function, which means the RCMP had formally written into its own establishment a rank whose purpose was to keep its regular members alive and moving in country they did not understand. In the Prairie West, this was useful. Then the force went north, and it stopped being useful and became structural. Where exactly did that shift happen, and what put the RCMP on the Arctic coast in the first place? It happened on a small island in the Beaufort Sea, and what put the force there was not crime. It was sovereignty. American whaling fleets had been wintering at Herschel Island in Canadian waters since about 1889. Traders in the Mackenzie Delta complained of undercut prices. Ship captains themselves wanted a neutral authority to settle disputes with their own crews. Ottawa ignored the petitions through the 1890s. The treasury was thin, and the Klondike had already absorbed the force's capacity. Then, in late 1903, the Alaska boundary dispute was settled in favor of the United States, and Canadian opinion turned sharply toward the question of what else might be lost by inattention. The government moved quickly. Detachments were established at Herschel Island and at Fullerton in 1903. Sergeant Francis Fitzgerald went up that August with a constable and an interpreter and camped into the autumn. The men lived in 2 sod huts. The sources disagree on the details, and it is worth stating the disagreement rather than smoothing it. The accompanying constable is recorded as Forbes Sutherland in the Veterans and Maritime Histories, and as Forbes Constantine in one broadcast account, and the post is dated to 1903 in some records and 1904 in others, with several sources reconciling this as an autumn camp in 1903 that became a permanent detachment the following year. In 1904, the winter mail run from Dawson to Fort McPherson was extended out to Herschel. In 1909, the detachment engaged its first Indigenous special constable. In 1910, Herschel became sub-district headquarters for the Royal Northwest Mounted Police in the Western Arctic. 6 years from sod huts to regional headquarters. What did the force have to put in place to make that possible? Not much. That is the whole point, and the figure is documented. By 1919, the entire Arctic was under Canadian jurisdiction, administered through 25 detachments staffed by just over 70 men. Sit with the arithmetic. 70 men. The Arctic archipelago and the mainland coast, a territory of millions of square kilometers. No roads, no rail, no telephone. Sea access for a few weeks a year, and in many places not even that. Tree River Detachment opened in 1919. Port Burwell, at the mouth of Hudson Strait, in 1920. Bache Peninsula on Ellesmere Island in 1926, which is as far north as any police force on Earth had ever tried to keep a permanent post. An average of under 3 men to a detachment, each detachment responsible for a district the size of a European country, each one reachable from headquarters by supply ship once a year if the ice allowed it. An institution can be honest about what a figure like that means. It means the detachment was not an outpost of a system. It was the system, entire, in that place. There was no reinforcement. There was no dispatcher. There was no second opinion. Whatever the 2 or 3 men at that post could do, that was the extent of what the government of Canada could do there. And of those 2 or 3 men, the one who could actually move across the country in February, find a camp that had shifted since last year, judge the ice at a river mouth, and speak to the people who lived there, that man was very often not the one who had been trained in Regina. So what, specifically, did he know? Start with the trail, because everything else follows from it. One of the hardest jobs given to a special constable was to walk ahead of the dogs on snowshoes, breaking trail through deep snow so the team and sled could follow. Hours of it. Days of it. Documented from the Dawson to Fort McPherson patrols in the 1920s onward. The man doing that work is not being led anywhere. He is producing the route the patrol travels on, with his legs, in real time. Then the routes themselves. Dog patrols followed traditional trails already in use by local people. The specials knew those routes, which is to say, the RCMP's patrol network in the north was, in physical fact, an existing indigenous travel network that the force had been shown. Then reading conditions. Weather, snow, ice, light, the direction and hardness of drift, which tells you you're heading when there is nothing else to take a heading from. Then, the dogs. Before snow machines, most northern families kept good teams, and the care of working dogs was a year-round discipline. Feeding, fish and meat often cooked in the winter months, feet checked, harness maintained. Here is the insider observation. When a member wrote in a patrol report that the party made a certain distance on a certain day, he was recording an outcome. The inputs, the ice judgment, the drift reading, the trail broken by hand, the decision not to attempt a crossing, were made by a man whose name might appear once on the engagement form and nowhere else in the file. Some of that knowledge could at least be demonstrated, but the patrol also had to talk to people. Who did that? The specials did, and the records of it are unusually specific. The Northwest Territories Archives holds an RCMP letter of engagement from 1929 for Special Constable Jimmy Fabian of Fort Resolution, taken on as dog driver and interpreter. 1 rank, 2 functions, 1 document. A force form from 1933 records that Special Constable James Fabian spoke English, French, Chippewayan, and Dog Rib, the language now called Tuyo. 4 languages, held by 1 man at 1 detachment, at a time when the constable beside him very likely held one. The RCMP arrived in the North without the languages of the North. Every statement taken, every explanation given, every inquiry into a death or a missing party, or a dispute over trapping ground, had to pass through an interpreter. Many specials and interpreters worked across a combination of local languages, French and English. Special Constable Vital Thomas was photographed at Ray, Behchoco, in 1962, still doing that work. And it went both ways, which the institution understood less well. The daughter of Special Constable Johnny Reindeer has described how people in the community would come to her parents when they had something to say to the RCMP and could not say it in the right words, and her parents would take it to the sergeant or the corporal. People were more comfortable approaching them than going to the police directly. Read that carefully. The Special Constable's house was the actual point of contact between the community and the government of Canada. But surviving in that country took more than language and trail sense. Who supplied the rest? Their families did, and specifically the women in them. Warm, well-made clothing is what kept RCMP members alive on the land, and it was not issued from stores. It was made. Sealskin, wolverine, caribou and moose hide, cut and sewn to time-tested designs by the wives and mothers and daughters of the specials. The same hands made the dog harness, the whips, the canvas booties that kept the dog's feet working, the blankets. The objects survive with names attached. A dog whip in the collection of the Prince of Wales Northern Heritage Centre was used by an RCMP inspector at Aklavik in 1945 and 1946. It was made by Martha Stewart, wife of Special Constable Andrew Stewart. The mittens, boots and sash that same inspector wore in 1945 were made by her as well. An Inuvialuit-style parka of ground squirrel, caribou and wolverine held in the same collection was made by Annie Caglick, daughter of Special Constable Lewis Caglick, at Aklavik in 1939. Mary Kendi, wife of Special Constable Alfred Kendi, supported the Aklavik detachment and is remembered in the Gwich'in community as a central figure there. Her daughter has described her making the parkas, the duffels, the mukluks, the fur mitts with mitt strings, and preparing bannock, dry meat and dry fish, for the members to carry on long trips. The patrol ration and the cold weather clothing system of the RCMP in the Western Arctic were, in practice, a household industry in the communities the force was there to police. So what did the institution give back, and what was the position of a special constable actually worth? In 1936, the RCMP began referring to Inuit employees at its Arctic detachments as special constables, an official rank, recorded as such. That is a real change and worth stating plainly. A designation, a place in the establishment, a form, a wage. It is more than guide. It is not the same thing as being a member of the force. The RCMP's own recent writing on its relationship with Inuit is direct about the rest of it. Inuit special constables carried multiple roles at once: guide, interpreter, cultural mediator, and their positions were often precarious and left them exposed to social ostracism within their own communities for helping to enforce colonial law and the paternalistic restrictions the government imposed. Their value to the force was twofold. They demonstrated their standing as members of their own communities, and they kept RCMP members alive in a climate the force had almost no experience of. Hold both halves of that. A man in this position was indispensable and subordinate at the same time. He was the reason the patrol functioned, and he was not the man whose signature closed the file. He was the community's route to the police, and the police's route into the community. And when the police did something the community could not forgive, he was standing there in the middle of it wearing part of a uniform. That last part is not incidental. It is the hardest thing in this subject. What was the RCMP asking these men to be part of? Things that are documented and that belong in any honest account of this rank. In 1933, the Indian Act legally appointed RCMP officers as truant officers, with the duty of enforcing residential school attendance and returning children who had run. The force has since apologized for its role in that system, twice at the level of commissioner, in 2004 and again in 2014. In 1953 and 1955, the RCMP, acting as representatives of the Department of Resources and Development, moved Inuit families from Inukjuak in northern Quebec and Midi-Matalik, Pond Inlet, to two locations in the high Arctic islands. From the mid-1950s onward, under ordinances requiring that dogs be tethered, large numbers of Inuit sled dogs were shot. The Chikiktani Truth Commission reviewed this on the basis of interviews with roughly 350 people and rejected the framing that treated Inuit grief over the loss as a merely cultural matter rather than a question of rights. For a family, a team was transport, hunting capability, income, and independence at once. The federal government apologized to Baffin Inuit for the dog killings and the relocations in 2019, and to Nunavik Inuit with compensation in 2024. This is the same institution, in the same decades, that depended on Indigenous men to reach any of those communities at all. Both are true. The special constable who broke trail in February and the detachment that enforced the Indian Act were the same establishment, and often the same two men. So what happened to that arrangement when the force no longer needed the dogs? It ended, in stages, over about 20 years. Aircraft came first, serving isolated communities that previously could be reached only by dog team. Radio reached the detachments and put an outside voice in a building that had never had one. Then the snowmobile arrived, and the long dependency broke. In March 1969, the RCMP ran its last dog sled patrol on duty, from Old Crow in the Yukon to Fort McPherson in the Northwest Territories, with Constable Warren Townsend and his team. The exhibit built by the Prince of Wales Northern Heritage Centre with RCMP G Division states the consequence without decoration. As the need for the skills and services the specials supplied in relation to dog teams and dog sled transportation lessened, the role changed. From the 1970s through the 1990s, special constables were encouraged to transition to regular member. The formal machinery followed. The RCMP established the Native Special Constable Program in 1973 to recruit more Indigenous members. In 1989, it converted Native Special Constables to regular member status. The rank, as a separate thing, was closed. There are men who went through the whole arc inside one career. Jerry Kassoon, an Inuvialuk from the Delta, joined as a special constable in 1971 on the advice of Special Constable Otto Binder, who served in the role for 25 years. Graduated as a constable in 1975, served in Alberta and the Yukon, and policed Tuktoyaktuk and Inuvik from 1986 to 1996. Conversion to full membership was a genuine correction of a real inequality. So what did the change not do? The Herschel Island Detachment closed for the last time in 1964. The last RCMP dog patrol ran in March 1969. In 1989, the native special constable rank was converted out of existence. What the change gave the institution: aircraft coverage and radio contact, so that a detachment was no longer alone with whatever arrived at its door. Faster response over distances that had taken weeks. Full membership, full pay scale, full career, full standing for men who had held none of those things while doing the work that made the detachments function. Those are real. None of them should be given back. What it did not give the country: the man in front of the dogs. A pilot can put a machine on the ice at a settlement in an hour. He has not spent 40 years on that coast. He does not know which family moved their camp last spring, or which river mouth goes bad in a thaw, or how to say the thing that needs saying so that it can be heard. Aircraft cover ground. They do not know it. The new system got there. It did not know the thing the old special constable knew. Nobody was asked to write it down before the kennels came out, and the rank was closed. The coast is still there. The ice still behaves the way it behaves. The knowledge is somewhere else now, in the communities, where it always was, and no longer on any establishment table in Ottawa. If this channel is going to keep documenting what Canadian patrol officers knew about their territories, and what it cost the institution when that knowledge left, subscribe. There are more roads, more detachments, more crossings, more patrols, with 3 pieces of information the file did not contain, and none of it was ever asked to write itself down. A lifetime on one coast gave a special constable something no GPS unit and no centralized dispatch has ever been built to hold, and the institution closed the rank before it worked out what that thing was. And if you have a patrol route, a posting, a winter trail, a detachment, put it in the comments. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle was a special constable, tell us his name and the country he knew. Next on this channel, March 1969. Old Crow to Fort McPherson. The last dog patrol the RCMP ever ran, and what came off the establishment along with the dogs.